Hi, my name is Sue Halpern. I am the author of this book, Can't Remember What I Forgot, The Good News from the Front Lines of Memory Research. And I am, among other things, a writer, and I'm also a scholar in residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. Just here very briefly, and it's actually really fun to be at Google. I'm sure people say this to you all the time, but it's particularly fun for someone who writes about memory to be at Google. We have outsourced our memory to you guys. I hope that you're doing a really good job with it. It seems so far that you're being very respectful. Although a lot of people think of memory, human memory, as kind of being an analog to computer memory, or computer memory being an analog to human memory, and that's not true yet. But in any case, it's really fun to be here, and thank you for having me. As a journalist, one of my jobs is to kind of wander around looking for interesting stories. And usually those stories present themselves in a kind of obvious way. You know, for instance, I have a story this week in the New Yorker magazine about virtual reality being used now to treat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a story that kind of came to me. I found the engineer and psychologist at USC who was working on it, and it just sort of evolved from there. This book evolved in a completely different way. Most of you are not in the correct demographic to completely appreciate this, but I am. And one of the things that I noticed was that like everyone around me was worried about their memory. And you know, every time they forgot a name of someone, or they misplaced a book, or they couldn't find their keys, they assumed that they had a disease. They just assumed, you know, the sort of standard line was, I must have early onset Alzheimer's. And, or, you know, excuse me, I'm having a senior moment, just something like that. We just heard that over and over and over again. And it just became this kind of cultural tic that people seem to have. And I felt really kind of out of it because I didn't feel that way. And I wondered kind of what was going on, like why did everyone else feel this way? And then around the same time that I was noticing this with all the people I was talking to, my father got sick, and in fact he had a progressive dementia. And so then I wondered if I was not just in denial, and that in fact I should have been worried. And that I was going to be susceptible to whatever was happening to him. The doctor said he didn't have Alzheimer's disease, which I found to be a relief, even though it was then became a non-specific problem. I thought it was a relief because Alzheimer's disease tends to run in families. And so I thought, well, then I must be at least a little bit exempt. But I did continue to wonder what was going on with him, and what was going on with my peers. And I noticed that no one really knew anything. There was a lot of anxiety and there weren't a lot of facts. And so I took it as an opportunity to wander around the world asking this question. And the question was, what is normal memory loss? Is there such a thing as normal memory loss? And what's the difference between that and, say, Alzheimer's disease? And weirdly enough, when I was doing this, I found that they didn't really know. Like this, it turned out, people said to me, well, normal, this was just a few years ago, they said normal is a new frontier. And I thought that was really weird because I would think, well, first you know what normal is, and then you figure out what pathological is. But in fact, with this stuff, it moved in the opposite direction. And the reason why it moved in the opposite direction was because so much of what was going on in brain research was being learned because people had diseases, or they had had brain injuries, or they'd had strokes. And so that's where the information was kind of bubbling up from. It was bubbling up from a problem. And no one really had gone to the kind of baseline and said, well, what does it really look like when it's functioning optimally? Well, weirdly, another weird thing is this. When it's functioning optimally, the curve of your memory looks like this. If you look, there's an inverse relationship between age. It's not a complete perfect one, but there's a pretty serious relationship between age and memory loss. As you get older, your memory stops functioning as well as it had. And so it's just, there is a slope, and it is not stepwise. It is just like this. It goes down, so that a person who's 35 has a better memory than a person who's 45, or you could say about yourself, at 35 you had a better memory than you have at 45, than you had at 55. It just goes on like that, which is perhaps depressing to you. But in fact, if you think about it in another way, you could just say, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I have a disease, you could just say, gee, I don't remember that guy's name. That's normal. No problem. That's how I choose to look at it. So in the course of doing the research for this book, I decided that I wanted to do a number of things. And so one of the things I wanted to do was hang out with some of the top neuroscientists in the country. An easier task said than done, only because these guys actually don't speak English. And so the first thing that I actually had to do was learn their language. This took way longer than I thought it would. It actually took a few years. It was like kind of going to graduate school in a subject that you hadn't studied ever before, which is what being a journalist is all about. So I parked myself at Columbia University, where I actually had taught in medical school, and hung out with a research group that had about 150 members who were working on the genetics and the molecular biology, who were making mouse models, who were doing neuropsych tests, who were doing work for DARPA on sleep deprivation. I mean, just kind of across the board. There were biostatisticians. And because they really had no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea what I was doing, I just stayed there and for years and just kind of watched them work, and they kind of got used to me being there, and they then sort of forgot that I was the writer, and kind of, I think some people there actually thought I was on staff. And so they would be going out into the community to do something or other, and they'd say, well, are you coming? And so I would. And so then one of the things that this research group was doing, which was kind of phenomenal, was that they have the largest database, largest genetic database for Alzheimer's disease in the world. And the way they got this was that they decided to do this very long-term epidemiological study of the neighborhood surrounding the hospital. And they had a grant to study every person who was over the age of 65. So every day they sent out a team of a research physician and some kind of epidemiologist and a psychologist into the community to take data, to get data about these people. So, they did memory tests, and they got their blood pressure taken, and they had their blood drawn. And certain numbers of them volunteered to have their brains scanned. So this accumulated data. And I got to go out and do that with them as well. One of the things that this research group found was that these people in this neighborhood were, well, we knew that they were primarily Dominican, and they found that the Dominicans in the neighborhood had a 3 times greater rate of Alzheimer's disease than anybody else. So that seemed fairly significant. And so then they said, well, okay, we've done this epidemiological study, and epidemiological studies are correlation studies, so it just means, okay, we can say this has happened, but we don't know why. We can assume it's genetic because they're, within the same kind of gene pool, but we don't know that for a fact. So I just happened to be there when they were going to the Dominican Republic to sort of do the same work. They were looking for the people who were related to the people who were in the neighborhood, and they were finding them. They're taking the same set of data, and because I was just hanging around and had been there for so long, I was actually there when they made a gene finding, which was kind of significant. There are only 2 risk factor genes for Alzheimer's and that have been proved, and this was the second one. So just by hanging out and being there, that was something that I was able to observe and kind of be in the thick of. And I also got to learn kind of how mean scientists could be, and how competitive and ruthless. And suddenly they had this great finding and they needed to publish it, and I was working on my book, and someone got really nervous that there I was, and I was going to spill the beans, and maybe I was a spy, and all this stuff. And for a while, it got kind of hairy, but it all worked out. I published a piece about them in the New Yorker. I promised not to disclose the name of the gene. I didn't. In the first draft of the piece, I actually noted what chromosome the gene was on. I had to take it out. The whole thing was very fraught, and I learned a lot about how science is done in this country, and it was a little distressing, but it was pretty fascinating. But also, remember, I wasn't really that interested in pathology. I just happened to kind of glom onto this thing with Alzheimer's disease. I was really interested in this question about normal memory and what happens and why, what's going on with us. And while I was there as well, a scientist named Scott Small made a pretty interesting finding. His idea was that normal memory and pathological memory loss look kind of alike in the beginning. And the reason is because there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus that goes bad, essentially, no matter whether it's normal memory loss or pathological memory loss. And everyone sort of knew that, and that was fine. But the fact was that Scott's hunch was that it had to be a different part of the hippocampus that was going wrong for both of these processes, because a pathology and normal can't really be the same thing. And so he invented a way of looking at brains in very high resolution. And the reason why he had to do that was because the way the scanners worked before that, you couldn't see what he was looking for, which was very specific parts of this one very small region of the brain. So his hunch was a different region went wrong for Alzheimer's than went wrong for normal memory. And he found, much to his delight, that he was right. And this is a huge, big finding. It's very new, and I write about it. And the reason why it's a huge, big finding is because, for a couple reasons. One is because when you treat Alzheimer's now, for instance, people there are a couple of drugs that people throw at Alzheimer's disease, and they don't really work very well. And one reason they don't work very well is they're kind of global. They affect the entire brain. So if you have a disease process and you're kind of throwing something at it and you're sort of hoping it's going to stick in the right spot, that's a somewhat random way to treat a disease. This finding says, okay, we know precisely where the problem lies. That's a huge finding because, and it's a molecular finding, so if we know what's going on and we know how the process works, then we can now target that spot and create drugs and interventions of other sorts to treat it. So there's that. So now there's Alzheimer's here over here, and it affects this one part of the hippocampus, and then you've got normal memory loss over here, and it's a whole other part of the hippocampus. And so what he's also found is that there's a particular molecule within the hippocampus that is kind of going bad as you get older. It starts to be expressed less. If that's true, then potentially you could also develop a drug to increase the expression of that gene, and therefore perhaps slow down or stop or prevent normal memory loss. That's a possibility. There are ethical issues you sort of think about, but that's why this finding is kind of huge. And the other reason it's huge is because Alzheimer's disease in particular is defined in a way, like, I don't know if you all kind of know about this, but people talk about plaques and tangles in an Alzheimer's brain. It's like the signature of Alzheimer's is that you have plaques and tangles. And until very recently, the only way you could see this was until after death. So the person had to be autopsied. They'd slice open their brain and they'd stain it, and they'd see these things that look like wads of gum and strands of hair, which shouldn't be there. And so the thinking was those are the things that are causing memory loss. In this new model, it says, well, that might be a really outmoded way of defining what Alzheimer's disease is. Also, it's not really that useful because if you can't do anything to see it till death, then it's just kind of a crapshoot. So if you can do what Scott's doing, which is see it in living brains, and you can see this kind of molecular distinction, then you have a way of defining what Alzheimer's disease might really be. And that could change kind of radically the notion of how this disease progresses and what it is, and give doctors a kind of a better sense of how this process works. So again, I was kind of sitting around there when all of this was happening, and it was pretty exciting. But one of the things about memory research I noticed very early on was that the very first memory researchers, this like scientists of memory, researched the disease on themselves. Like they did their experiments on themselves. And I decided to take this on as a challenge, and that I would have to do it to myself too. And as a consequence, I decided to get my brain scanned in every single way that you get your brain scanned. And I decided to take all the tests that you would take to find out whether or not I was normal or whether I was diseased. And so this put me on a kind of interesting trajectory. I decided to try, in the beginning, I decided to try all the supplements, see if I got smarter, better, faster, quicker. I joined a bunch of brain gyms, this was all in the name of science. It was kind of amusing, however. So the first thing I did was I got in touch with an editor I'd worked with at Slate, and I said, here's my idea. You know, there are all these products out there like ginkgo and focus factor and vitamin E and I don't know what else. I had a long list. And I said, my idea is I'm going to test them all, and then I'm going to write about it. And we'll do it as a service piece. And we'll rate them. And this was before I really had thought this idea through. He thought it was a fantastic idea. So I said I was going to go off and do this. And I went to the drugstore and I looked, and I purchased vitamin E and 4,000 different kinds of vitamins that people were promoting as kind of good for your brain. And basically there's a whole new section of the drugstore devoted to your bad memory, or mine. And so I kind of cleared it out and brought it all home and had it there, and kind of couldn't decide what to take first. I took the vitamins first because I figured that's pretty benign. Take some vitamins, not a problem. And then I couldn't decide, what am I going to do? Should I take the ginkgo first or the focus factor? And then what if I take the ginkgo and then I take the focus factor at the same time? What would happen? How would I know what was working? What would be the effect? I mean, all the questions of research science came up while I stared at all of these things that I purchased for a lot of money that the magazine was happily paying for. And I realized that this was a very poor idea because I wasn't going to be able to do it. I could devote my entire life to this task because I'd have to take it for how long. I'd have to kind of make myself a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which was kind of impossible because I was only one person. And so then I typed in the name of one of the products that was touted as being really good for your memory. And it was this stuff called, I think it was called colloidal gold. I'd never heard of it before. I was curious. I went to Google, and you guys sent me to a cached FDA website. It had been taken offline, but I got it anyhow. And it was a website where people had written in their experiences with supplements. And obviously, the people who had really good experiences probably weren't writing in. So, to that extent, it was biased. But for the people who wrote in, it was, well, I'm blind now. Can't walk anymore. I suffered debilitating headaches. I can't digest anything. And then there was he died. So I gave that up. I stopped. Decided this was a poor idea. I even stopped taking the vitamins. I just figured, why? So then I thought, okay, well, I'll test the brain gyms. I don't know if you've seen this, but you probably all know this just from your work. The number of online sites that purport to help you have a better memory has just burgeoned. When I started this project, there were maybe 2. Now there are many more than 2. and they do different things. So I signed up for, I think, 4 of them eventually. I did the first 2, and then as I was doing my work, other ones came online, and I signed up for them as well. There were some that were just on disc. I signed up for those. And again, sort of my shelf kind of filled up with all this stuff that I was going to be doing for my brain. And so I started doing them, and they were pretty interesting. The one that I kind of did religiously, I did sort of I thought it was kind of fun. I actually never thought it was going to improve my memory, but it was kind of an interesting task. And as a writer, you're always looking for things to procrastinate with. And so this was fantastic, because I could just sit there and think, I'm doing my work. And a lot of it was things like increasing your processing speed. So like a star would appear on the computer screen, and then like a letter, let's just say, and if the letter showed up, you couldn't press the space button, but if the star showed up, you could, and you just had to like bang on the thing. And at first I thought, well, maybe this is just like playing slot machines at Vegas, and you just like do it the whole time. I was like, space bar, but it actually didn't work that way, and I got a very bad score, which was bad because they were tracking me against my peers, and I looked bad. So I kind of got used to this, and it was just kind of fun. But I wasn't really convinced that I was training my memory to get better, or even, there are all these testimonies on this website, like I used to make $25,000 a year, and now I make $50,000 a year because I could do everything twice as fast. That didn't happen to me. Then I did another one, which was kind of interesting because it corresponded in some way to the IQ test, to one part of the IQ test. There's a part of the IQ test called digit span, where you have to remember long strings of numbers. And they ask you to remember them, going forwards and then going backwards. And so this particular brain gym, really all it did was kind of teach you how to do digit span. It's like a parlor trick, how to remember all these long strings of numbers. And I met this guy years later who runs something called the Memory Olympics, and his whole thing was that IQ tests can be kind of gamed, and if you learn digit span really well, you could basically have an IQ of 300. And I was kind of interested in that, but in fact, I don't think my IQ went up a whole heck of a lot. But I did get reasonably good at digit span, particularly digit span going backwards. But again, it didn't really have very much. It didn't really connect to memory as far as I could tell. It was just something to do. And that's what a lot of these products are. There's something to do. They kind of trade on people's anxieties. And I pretty much looked at all of them just because I was interested in this question of anxiety and this kind of moment in time that we live in, where everyone is so worried about their memory if they're, say, over 35 or 40. And all the people who are kind of being entrepreneurs and kind of working their way into this to make money, which distressed me. One of the reasons why I was doing these brain gyms, though, was because I knew I was going to take these neuropsych tests. And there's a kind of a turf war between the psychologists and the sort of technologists in neuroscience. And the technologists say, take a picture of the brain. You've got this, physical artifact. You can look at it. You can really understand what's going on in a brain if you can look at it in its function and in its structure. And the neuropsych people say, well, we have these tests. They're pretty good. We've been using them forever. They really test lots of different parts of someone's brain. What you're good at, what you're not good at, and they say, it's just as good a way of getting a picture of how someone's brain is functioning than a picture is. In fact, they say it might be better because it's kind of more dimensional. And so I knew I was going to take these tests, and the way I saw them was it was sort of like the SAT for grown-ups. And so when you take the SAT, they tell you that you can't study. And then everyone goes and takes, the Princeton Review class or the Kaplan class, and their score goes up. So obviously you can study. So I figured maybe you could study for neuropsych. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to study for my neuropsych test so I didn't come out looking really stupid, because I knew I was going to be writing about it, and I didn't want to be like adult. You know, I'd have to like kind of expose myself to the world as kind of being an idiot. So it was kind of nerve-wracking. So that's one of the reasons why I did the brain gyms. I thought, well, they would help me when I was taking these tests. I actually think they probably helped me to some extent in terms of going into the test thinking I had a pretty good idea of what I might be encountering. And then I got there, so I was a little confident when I went in. I was a little scared, but I was also confident. And then I got there, and let's just say it was the digit span test. Now remember, I had been doing this digit span thing for a couple months, and I was feeling like I was pretty good at it. When I did it on the computer, the numbers would, come across the screen, and I would actually say them out loud to myself. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, one of the things that your brain is doing when it is taking in information is it's taking it in through the hippocampus with all your senses kind of engaged. So if you're just reading something, you're getting it through one sense, right? You're getting it through sight. When I was looking at the numbers on the screen, I was getting the numbers on the screen visually, but I was saying them out loud, so I was hearing them as well. When I walked into the testing room, one of the first things that the woman who was testing me said was, you can't say anything out loud. I'm gonna show you the numbers, I'm gonna put them in front of you, and as soon as I take them away, I want you to say them out loud, and you can't even say them to yourself quietly. And in fact, there was no time to say them to myself quietly. And I was completely thrown for a loop, because that's not how I did digit span. And so for the beginning of doing digit span on this test, I did really badly, because I didn't know how to do it just by looking. To that extent, I think I actually kind of screwed myself up by doing kind of studying for this exam. But the tests were really interesting, and they did a kind of basic word recall test, which is if someone's worried about Alzheimer's disease, the very first test they might do is like a 10-word recall, and then you're asked to remember those words over time. So you do them the first time, someone says the 10 words, and you say them back, and then about 5 minutes later they say, remember that list of words? Well, tell me what they are, and then they'll maybe do it 15 minutes later. A person who's normal will, let's just say, remember 5 or 6 words the first time around. You would think, well, what happens by the end is they remember almost all of them, because after you say it the first time, they'll repeat the 10 words, and you say, okay, well, I remember those 6, but now I've got to remember these next couple. For someone who's sick, all bets are off. They tend to remember, they could remember 3 or 4 words, or even 6 words the first time, and the second time they might remember 3, and they don't get better. Whereas a person who's normal, even though they start out not remembering all the words, eventually remember all the words, or close to it. So the tests were kind of interesting, because they would do things like that, or they would tell you a story. And the story would be something like, Jamie was a cook at a school, and she was walking home from work one day, and she was mugged, and she lost all her money, and she went home, and she couldn't pay her rent, so she got evicted. And when she got evicted, she was living on the street, and it was sort of gone and on and on about this kind of thing that happened to Jamie. And the first time they would ask you, they would say, tell me everything you remember about this story. And you'd say everything that I just told you. And they would grade you. Like I would watch the testers like checking off, and then by the end she'd say, any more, and you knew that you'd like missed like whole parts of this story. The second time she asked me to recall this story, she said, tell me this story verbatim. Tell me the words I used when I told you the story, which I thought was really hard and interesting, because it's a completely different way of remembering than sort of remembering the outlines of a story, is remembering how it's told to you. So that was testing a different domain. And there were visual memory tests, some of which, sometimes when you remember things visually, it's because it's attached to something verbal. And sometimes when you remember, if you have a really good visual memory, you can just remember things because that's the kind of memory you have. You can look at things and remember what they look like. And I'm not one of those people. I don't remember things like that. And so I did really badly. I thought I'd done really badly on that part of the test because I didn't know what was going on. She would show me these pictures. They were really complicated. And I would look at them, and then she'd turn the page and say, remember those 3 pictures you saw? Well, here are 9 more that are just like that. Figure out which of the 3 you saw, and then it all has to happen really fast. And I just finally, I gave up, and I would just go, doot, doot, doot. And that was, I mean, I really couldn't do it, and I was feeling a little uncomfortable with that. But I kind of realized at the end that I never thought I had a good visual memory, so it didn't completely matter. And what came home to me was that we're all a mix of things that we're good at and we're not so good at. So like when people say to me things like, well, I meet someone at a party and I don't remember 2 minutes later their name, and I'll say, well, and then they'll say, so I must be getting sick, right? One of the things that happens when you write a memory book is that everyone thinks you actually can diagnose them. So then I say, no, probably not. You're probably not sick. I'll say things like, well, did you ever remember someone's name when you met them at a party? Were you really good at that at some other point in time? And then they think and they go, well, no, not really. And that's sort of the thing. Like everyone has a kind of pattern that they have established in their life of their, what they're good at in terms of memory and what they're not good at. And it's almost the same thing as like you are good at certain things, certain tasks in your life, and that's probably why those are the jobs that you choose to do. Like for instance, I didn't choose to be an architect. I couldn't be an architect. I have no visual memory. I'm not that good in math. I chose to be a writer. I remember most of those stories verbatim. I did really well on all those word list tests. I remembered all the words. I am, that's my kind of domain. That's where I reside, and some people reside in another domain. So when you're sort of thinking about your memory and whether you're, losing it, you have to sort of take stock of where you've always been. And I think that calms people down. It makes them realize, that maybe what's going on in their life is actually very consistent. The other thing I've noticed that's kind of interesting to me is that people will come up and say, I don't remember anything anymore. I can't remember, where I put my keys or where I parked my car, whatever the things are. And then, and again, they're old. They tend to be older. And I'll say, do you have a kid? Do you have a teenager? Yeah. How many times has your kid lost their cell phone? And it's like, oh yeah. Like, have you ever gone to Lost and Found at a school? Oh yeah. It's like, everyone has these glitches, but it's only when people get older, I think, that they start thinking in terms of disease and in terms of, sort of the rest of their life kind of going bad. And it's just, you really have to be kind of self-aware when you're thinking about this stuff. When you look at the statistics of who's sick, who's not sick, remember I told you 100% of us are going to have memory difficulties as we get older, at least memory loss. It's just inevitable. But not all of us, in fact, only a small percentage of us will actually get something like Alzheimer's disease. The numbers are still in our favor. You tend not to get that disease until you're very old, and most people don't live long enough to get it. So it's just a kind of interesting thing to keep in your mind. Just keep those numbers in your mind if you're starting to feel really anxious. One of the statistics I read was that more people are worried about getting Alzheimer's disease than they are about getting cancer, but in fact, more people will get cancer than will get Alzheimer's disease. So that kind of taps you into the anxiety of the moment. That's kind of where our heads are at. So I did all these neuropsych tests. I did the 6 hours at NYU. Forgot all about them. They lasted, they were kind of interminable. And then they told me they would get in touch with me many months later. And as a consequence, I really did kind of forget that I'd ever done them. And then I got a letter from NYU one day, and it was a kind of a thin envelope, and I opened it up, and And there was just one paragraph, and basically it said, based on all your tests, you're normal. And my first reaction was, great, I'm normal, that's good. Then I remembered that curve, and I thought, great, I'm like everyone else, I'm heading downward. Then I remembered, the norm just means that, you're like everyone else. So I kind of wanted to be better than everyone else. That wasn't happening. And then again, I sort of put it aside, and it took me a long time before I would go back to NYU and ask the psychologist in charge of the study to tell me what it really meant. And so she went through every one of the different domains of these tests that I had taken. And the weirdest thing happened while we were doing this. So basically she told me that, in all the verbal parts I had done really well, which was no big surprise. But then we came to the visual memory part, the task where I just kind of randomly said, yeah, it must be those 3 pictures that I had no idea about. And she told me I did better than my peers. So all I could think was that my peers had done the exact same thing I had done, but I just picked better than they did. And I was feeling kind of like I had cheated, but I was also feeling kind of good, like, okay, I did better than my peers on this visual memory test, which was impossible. So then I went to UCLA to get tested again. And there are different tests. Each testing site kind of modifies the tests as they see fit. And so this was a whole different set. Although that story about Jamie was the same. It was the only one. And I didn't want to tell her. I already knew the story. But what was weird was I had heard that story maybe 8 months before I took those tests, and I still remembered it. So I figured I didn't need to tell her. I'm telling her now. So I went to UCLA. I took these tests, and again, there was this really, really challenging visual memory test. And it was a different challenging visual memory test than the first one. And it required, they showed this incredibly complicated geometric shape in very many dimensions. And then they said, draw this. And I drew, I'm telling you, it was very complicated. Mine sort of looked like, a house or something. Mine was very pathetic. And then about 15 minutes later, she said, remember that really complicated geometric shape I showed you before? Draw that again. And then now my house just looked like a cube. It was kind of pathetic. So later on, I got my results from UCLA. And similarly to NYU, all my verbal tests were really fine and dandy. And then she said that I was impaired on my visual memory. And I was not real pleased with that. In fact, the weird thing was, because I had done the UCLA test second, I also sort of didn't care. I thought, well, I don't have a good visual memory. I already knew that. I don't know that I'd call it impaired. I can, negotiate the world, and, I thought it was kind of harsh. But then I thought about it, and I just thought, as she said to me, we're all a mix of things. So some of us are really good at visual memory, some of us aren't. I am not. And it kind of gave me this notion of what normal is. And the way I think of normal now is that there's normal in the aggregate. So we're all sort of stuck together. And when these testers think about normal, they think about who you are with in your age group, your gender, your socioeconomic and education, your socioeconomic class and education. So those are kind of the defining features, and then they sort of lump you with all the people who kind of look like you, and then you get measured against how those people did. So that's normal in the aggregate. And then there's normal for you, like what is individually true for you. And so for me, normal is having a really crummy visual memory. Whereas for someone else, normal might be having a really terrible verbal memory. So you have to, again, when you're sort of thinking about your own self and where you fit in this whole scheme of things, you have to really kind of know yourself fairly well to know if, in fact, things are not as they used to be. And when I was at Columbia, there was a guy there who's a professor who was emeritus, and people talked about him all the time because this guy was really, really, really smart. To the point where his digit span was probably, like 3,000 numbers or something. His IQ was very, very high, and he tested off the charts on these tests all the time, but he was complaining that he was having memory loss. And no one kind of took him that seriously. He kept on saying, there's something that's not right, there's something that's not right, and there's something that's not right. But every time they tested him, he tested just fine. He always tested actually above the norm. And eventually, he got diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He knew he had it before anyone else did because he knew himself pretty well. He knew what he had been capable of, and he knew that it was going away, but there was no way to actually test for it. So, self-knowledge is probably a good thing in this field. So I did all of this stuff, and when I started the project, I was kind of nervous about memory, nervous about the tests. By the time I finished, I was feeling okay. And then I went and got sort of all these brain scans, and my favorite brain scan, I had two sort of favorite brain scans. The first was here in California. There's a guy who's kind of an entrepreneur. He gives people brain scans. You have to pay him like $3,000, and it's like kind of phrenology. He kind of reads your brain and tells you, what's wrong with you. But he's also a doctor, and people pay many, many thousands of dollars to go to him. So I decided I would do this too, not to pay him. I was a volunteer, and so I got my brain scanned. And the night before I was getting my brain scanned, I went to the beach, was hanging out, reading a book, and this guy sat down next to me, was reading a book on Jewish mysticism, and I said, well, why are you interested in this? And he said, well, it's about the energy. And I was saying, well, that's kind of interesting, because I'm about to go have my brain kind of looked at and using kind of interesting manipulations of energy. And he asked me what I was doing there, and I said I was going to get a radioactive dye put into my body the next day, and then they were going to look at my brain. He told me I was crazy and that I should leave right then and get back on the plane and go home, which I didn't do. But my other sort of favorite one was I went to Brookhaven National Lab, which is a high particle physics lab in New York. In order to do the work they do, they're going to inject you with the dye, which goes into your brain, and then they take a picture of your brain, quote unquote, doing nothing, which is almost impossible. So they did that, and they make their own isotope, the radioisotope. And so they lay you down on this gurney. They put a venous line in one arm and an arterial line in the other arm. It's very painful. You're kind of lying there. They make a helmet for your head out of styrofoam, and then they encase you in it, your head in it, and they strap you. They put tape and they put you down. And I was doing this thing, and then I was done, and it was all over. It was like a couple hours later, and they told me I couldn't leave through the front door because I was so radioactive that I was going to set off the alarms. That was a little disconcerting. Anyhow, as I say, by the time I was done, I ended up feeling incredibly hopeful about what was going on, both with me, because I was normal, and with you, because you were too. And that's the thing, I think, to understand, that for those of us who are normal, we're going to have these glitches. That's okay. For those who are going to get sick, the people who are working on the genetics and on the molecular biology and on the pharmacology are getting so close to coming up with targeted and effective ways of treating this stuff that, again, I think that 5 years from now, this will be a completely different conversation. So, and speaking of conversation, I will turn it over to you if you guys have any questions. Usually people do have questions because they're worried about their memory.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was just wondering if in your travels you found out anything about the effects of meditation on memory?
Yeah, I didn't write about it, but in fact, there is a person in Boston, I think, working maybe through Beth Israel Hospital. They did brain scans on people who meditated, whose memory did improve. Meditation turns out to be really good. And I think at one point the Dalai Lama had actually been involved in some of these studies on the effect of meditation and mind, and it is a very good thing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Nobody else? No one's worried about their mind? Oh, you are? Good.
So once memory is lost, is it possible to regain it? Now, you've just indicated that meditation can be helpful. As we get older, we're losing more and more. Can I rejuvenate my brain at all?
Yes, what a good question. So was maybe the most remarkable finding that I was able to witness. One of the things that people know about the brain is that we don't get born with a finite number of brain cells and then they kind of diminish over time, and therefore that's why we're kind of dumber at the end than we were at the beginning. That's not true. We don't get born with a finite number. We continue to produce new neurons all through the life cycle. But what happens as you get older is that production slows down. So you're producing fewer new neurons. And one of the hypotheses about why an older brain isn't quite as good as a younger brain is just because this production has slowed down. That's interesting in and of itself. But a few years ago, a scientist in La Jolla at the Salk Institute decided to do a study with some mice and exercise. And he took the mice, he had a control group of mice, and then he took some mice and he scanned all of them before, put them in the mouse scanner, took pictures of their brains, and then stuck them in cages that had like mouse wheels and pedometers. And before the tests, before the exercise protocol, he gave them memory tests. And a memory test for a mouse is really kind of fun to watch, sort of. There's something called a Morris water maze, and you sort of think of a pool with spokes coming out of it, and or like channels. The things on the sides are like channels. And there's a platform, and this platform is submerged, and mice don't like water. So they put the mouse on the platform. The mouse kind of gets a sense of where this is or not. And then they figure out which part of the axis, which radial arm they're going to stick the mouse, and they put the mouse in, and the mouse has to find where the submerged platform is. So some mice do better at this than others. So they had a baseline of these tests with the mice, and they tested them again after an exercise protocol of about 2 months or something like that. The mice in the control group did exactly the same as the mice in the control group had done. They were consistent. The mice that exercised did better on their memory tests than the mice that didn't exercise. The mice that logged the most kilometers on their wheels did even better than the mice that logged fewer kilometers. And then they scanned them again, and they found that the mice that had exercise had grown new neurons, and that the mice who exercised the most grew the most neurons. So that is great, but we're not mice. And so last year, or about a year and a half ago, this same protocol was introduced for people. So sedentary people did the memory tests. They were scanned, and guess what? The results were exactly the same. So this leads people to understand that if you exercise aerobically, you have the capacity to boost your production of new neurons. And that's a remarkable fact. So if I told you I had a drug that would do the same thing, that would get you new neurons, that would make them synaptically connect, that would improve your memory, you would say, bring it on. If I said, how much would you pay me? You'd tell me you'd pay me a lot. And what I'm telling you is there's this thing that you can do for yourself that does all of those things, and it's free, and it's available, and all it has to do is be aerobic.
What's your exercise program?
Elliptical machine, riding my bike, and cross-country skiing.
Excellent.
And today, climbing some of the taller hills in San Francisco.
Good. The other question has to do with Alzheimer's. And you indicated that it is hereditary. Recently I saw something or heard something that said that it may not be hereditary, so I'm just curious. My mom has Alzheimer's.
Okay, I don't think it's hereditary necessarily. There's early onset Alzheimer's. There's a kind of Alzheimer's that people get that is genetic. If you get born with the gene, you get the disease. It just kind of follows the laws of Mendelian genetics, and it's very sad. But most people won't get that. It's very, very rare. So, and most people don't get early onset Alzheimer's disease anyhow. Most people get Alzheimer's disease after the age of 65. Right. Okay. So that's called sporadic Alzheimer's disease, and there's not a one-on-one genetic correspondence. There's no gene that you get born with and then you get Alzheimer's disease. Rather, there are things called risk factor genes. And what the thinking is that since we know that Alzheimer's runs in families, it doesn't mean that if your mother has Alzheimer's, you'll get Alzheimer's. It just means that if you look at the family trees of people who have Alzheimer's in their family, it tends to run in those families. So if that's true, it's sort of leading the scientists to think, okay, there must be a genetic component. And the first risk factor gene was found about 12 years ago. If you have that risk factor gene, you have a 20% greater chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. But a lot of people get Alzheimer's disease who don't have that gene, and a lot of people who have that gene don't get Alzheimer's. So only 1 in 5 of the people who have that gene get Alzheimer's. So 4 of those 5 don't. So the thinking is that there are a passel of genes, a lot of genes that put you at risk, but that they have to interact with other parts of your life to kind of get triggered. And so the second risk factor gene was the one that I was writing about, and that has an even smaller effect, a much smaller effect. There aren't that many people who have it. The people who have it don't necessarily get it, but some of the people do, and it puts them at a greater risk. And then there are lifestyle issues that go along with it.
So we talked about meditation and exercise just now. Were there any other things that you came across that impressed you in terms of just a healthy, what to do to increase the health of your mind? It sounded like your experiment with supplements was something you said this isn't the right approach, but
Right.
is there any credence in any of them or any other activities, be it puzzles or creative activities or other things you put yourself through?
Okay, so I read about all the supplements and kind of went through them all and looked at the science, even though I wasn't going to swallow any of them. But the kind of bottom line on the supplements was told to me by a neuroscientist at NYU who said basically, if there's anything that you find in nature that you can find in a natural form as opposed to the form of a pill, that's where you should be taking it. So the vitamin E studies, if you take vitamin E, for instance, in an avocado, you're going to get the effect. If you take it in a pill, you're probably not, although you'll put yourself at risk for thinning your blood, so that's not a good thing. But one of the questions I wanted to find out was if you did crossword puzzles, which everyone says you've got to do crossword puzzles and then you're going to never get Alzheimer's disease or something like that. So I went around and I asked all the sort of leading neuroscientists in the world, should I be subscribing to the New York Times crossword puzzle, and is that going to save me? And my favorite answer was given to me by a guy who's here at UCSF. He kind of leaned back in his chair and he kind of looked me over and he said, well, let me ask you a question. Do you like doing crossword puzzles? I said, no, not really. And he said, then don't do them. So that was that answer. But there was this really great study done at Albert Einstein. And again, it's an epidemiological study, so it's not like a scientific study exactly. I mean, it's more social science-y. So it's looking at correlations. So they looked at people over time. And they did this lifestyle kind of survey, are people doing crossword puzzles? Are they, jogging? Are they depressed and isolated? Whatever the things are about those people. And so they had this fairly large database, and it's longitudinal study, so they could see, and by a certain number of years later, they could see who had developed Alzheimer's and who hadn't. And then they could go back and see, well, is there anything in their lifestyle that would indicate that one thing or another was protective? And the crossword puzzles didn't really have much of an effect, if any at all. Those people, it in fact had no effect. The thing that came out was that people who did ballroom dancing, sorry, people who did ballroom dancing, that seemed to be the most protective of all of the things. And the reason is, if you think about it, it requires spatial reasoning, it's aerobic, it's complicated, so you've got the kind of mental thing going, and it's social. And it turns out that social is crucial. So, if you're sitting in your room just doing your crossword puzzle all by yourself, that's you're pretty isolated. There's not a lot going on. There's not a lot coming at you. If you're dancing with these guys, things are happening, and so social becomes really crucial. And I tell the story about this beagle study of elderly beagles. that's being conducted at UCI. And so these dogs are given, there's a control group of dogs, and then there's a group of dogs that are given an enriched diet, so lots of antioxidants put into their dog chow, and then there's a group that gets what is called an enriched environment. It's sort of they're the Cuban salsa dancers of the kennel. They get to play with each other, they get a trainer, they get a lot of really cool toys. And so then they went, and then of course they did memory tests on them, and it's actually not true that you actually can teach old dogs new tricks, but it takes a very long time. Except that the dogs who were the control group, they didn't have enough time, so they didn't really learn any new tricks. But the other dogs did, and the dogs who had the enriched environment and the enriched food did the best. But between the ones with the enriched food and the enriched environment, the ones with the enriched environment, those social dogs, learned quicker, better, more than the dogs who just had good food. So I think what it would tell you is, eat good food, get your supplements through food, your antioxidants through food, your catecholamines through food, all your phytochemicals through food, and hang out with your friends and do something physical with them.
Sounds like fun. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what could be worse than that? So, yeah. All right. I think that's it. Thank you guys so much.